The year was 1847, and Mary Ann held her swollen belly as their wagon bounced over another rock on the endless trail. 8 months pregnant, she shouldn't have been making this journey west. But her husband William had dreams of land and gold that called stronger than common sense. "Easy there, girl," William called out to their tired oxen as the wagon lurched forward. Behind them stretched a line of 20 other families, all hoping to reach Oregon Territory before winter set in. The wagon train had been moving for 3 months now, and Mary Ann could see the exhaustion written on every face they passed. The Great Plains spread out around them like an ocean of grass, so vast it made her feel dizzy sometimes. Back in Pennsylvania, she'd never seen so much empty space. Here, you could walk for days and never see another soul, except for the occasional distant figure on horseback that made everyone nervous. Mary Ann pressed her hand against her side, where the baby kicked. Actually, babies. The midwife back home had told her she was carrying twins, though she hadn't shared this news with anyone on the trail. People already whispered that pregnant women brought bad luck to wagon trains. She didn't need to give them more reason to worry. "How you holding up back there?" called out Mrs. Peterson from the wagon behind them. The older woman had become like a mother to Mary Ann during their journey, helping her win the morning sickness. "Got too bad in sharing her extra blankets during the cold nights?" "I'm managing," Mary Ann called back, though the truth was getting harder to hide. The babies seemed to be getting restless, moving more than usual. Sometimes the pain in her back got so sharp she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The wagon master, a tough man named Captain Brooks, rode up alongside them on his horse. His weathered face looked more serious than usual as he studied the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he announced. "Big one by the looks of it. Need to find shelter soon." William looked around at the flat grassland stretching. "In every direction? Shelter? Out here?" "There's a creek about 2 miles ahead with some trees," Brooks replied. "We'll circle up there and wait it out." As if summoned by his words, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. The oxen shifted nervously, and Mary Ann felt her stomach tighten. Not from the storm, but from something else. Something that made her catch her breath. The pain started as a dull ache, like the backaches she'd been having for weeks. But as they pressed toward the creek, it grew stronger. By the time the wagons formed their protective circle among the cottonwood trees, Mary Ann was gripping the wagon seat so hard her knuckles turned white. "William?" she whispered, but her husband was busy unhitching the oxen with the other men. The first fat raindrops began to fall. Everyone was rushing to secure their belongings before the storm hit. Another wave of pain crashed over her, this one so strong it took her breath away. She looked down and saw wetness spreading across her dress. Her heart started racing as she realized what was happening. "William," she called out louder this time, just as lightning split the sky above them. He turned around, and one look at her face told him everything. "Oh no," he breathed. "Not now. Not here." The storm hit with full force just as the contractions began. In earnest, rain pounded against the canvas top of their wagon while Mary Ann labored inside, with only Mrs. Peterson and 2 other women to help her. The men huddled around their fires outside, trying to keep them burning in the downpour.
"Oh, this?
"Baby's coming whether we're ready or not," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Mary Ann, you need to focus on your breathing." But Mary Ann could barely hear her over the thunder and her own panic. Everything was happening too fast. The babies weren't supposed to come for another month. What if something went wrong? If they didn't survive out here in the middle of nowhere? Lightning illuminated the inside of the wagon like daylight, followed immediately by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the earth. Mary Ann screamed, not from the storm, but from the overwhelming urge to push. "I can see the head." Mrs. Peterson shouted over the noise. "One more push, honey." The first baby arrived with a flash of lightning that lit up the whole prairie. Tiny, perfect boy, who immediately began crying, as if protesting his dramatic entrance into the world. Mary Ann laughed and sobbed at the same time, reaching for her son with shaking hands. But the relief was short-lived. Another contraction hit almost immediately. "There's another one coming," Mrs. Peterson announced, and Mary Ann's eyes went "Why'd another what?" demanded William from outside the wagon. "Another baby," Mrs. Peterson called back. "Twins." The second boy arrived just as the storm began to calm, his cries joining his brother's in a perfect harmony that somehow made the thunder seem less frightening. Mary Ann held both babies against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she counted their tiny fingers and toes. "They're so small," she whispered. "Are they going to be okay?" Mrs. Peterson wrapped the babies in clean blankets and placed them back in Mary Ann's arms. Twins born early often are smaller, but they look strong. Listen to those healthy cries. Outside, the other families were starting to emerge from their wagons as the storm moved on. Word spread quickly through the camp about the twin boys born during the worst of the weather. Some of the older folks said it was a good sign that babies born in storms were destined for great things. But Mary? Anne could see the worry in the men's faces as they gathered around Captain Brooks. She caught pieces of their conversation, carried on the wind. Lost time. Dangerous territory. Double quotes. She pulled her babies closer, a cold fear settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the damp night air. The birth had been difficult, and she felt weak and dizzy. But more than that, she could sense the tension in the camp. William climbed back into the wagon, his clothes soaked from the rain. He looked at his wife and sons with a mixture of joy and concern that made Mary Ann's heart sink. "They're beautiful," he said softly, touching each baby's tiny hand. "But Mary Ann, we have a problem." She had been afraid of this moment since the pains began. "What kind of problem?" Brooks says. "We're in Sioux territory now. The storm put us behind schedule, and every day we delay here increases our danger. The other families are getting nervous." Mary Ann felt the blood drain from her face. "I can travel. Just need a day or two to recover." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The difficult birth had left her feeling like she'd been trampled by the oxen. Every movement sent waves of exhaustion through her body, and she could barely keep her eyes open. "Just rest tonight," William said, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We'll figure something out in the morning." As the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Mary Ann lay awake holding her twins, listening to their soft breathing and the distant howl of coyotes across the prairie. She had no way of knowing that this night would be the last peaceful moment she would share with both of her sons, or that the real storm was only just beginning to gather on the horizon of their lives. Morning came too soon, and with it came the harsh reality of their situation. Mary Ann woke to the sound of heated voices outside her wagon. Her body felt like it was on fire, and when she tried to sit up, the world spun around her like a child's. Both babies were crying, hungry, and needing attention she could barely give. Her arms felt too heavy to lift, and sweat poured down her face despite the cool morning air. Something was very wrong, but she forced herself to try feeding the twins, her hands shaking with the effort. "I don't care what you think," she heard Captain Brooks saying outside. "We can't wait here another day. This is hostile territory, and that storm yesterday probably gave away our position to every war party within 50 miles. But my wife just gave birth." William's voice carried clearly through the canvas. "She needs time to recover." "Look around you, Miller," Brooks shot back. "See those hills to the north? Perfect place for an ambush. We've already stayed too long. Every minute we waste here puts 20 families at risk." Mary Ann tried to call out to William, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The fever was getting worse, making her thoughts fuzzy and confused. She could hear Mrs. Peterson talking to someone near her wagon, but the words seemed to come from far away. "Mrs. burning up with fever," Mrs. Peterson was saying. "This isn't just exhaustion from the birth. Something's wrong." "What kind of wrong?" That was William's voice, tight with worry. "This could be childbed fever. I've seen it before. Sometimes women get it after difficult births, especially out here where we can't keep things as clean as we should." Mary Ann heard footsteps approaching her wagon, then William's face appeared over the tailgate. Even through her fever, she could see the fear in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "The babies," she managed to whisper. "Are they okay?" William climbed into the wagon and looked at his sons. Both were still crying, their faces red and wrinkled. He picked up one of them awkwardly. unsure how to hold something so small and fragile.
There.
Fine, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. You just focus on getting better. Outside, the arguments were getting louder. Marianne could hear other families joining the discussion, their voices mixing together in a chorus of fear and frustration. My children's lives matter too, one woman was saying. We all knew the risks when we started this journey. She's one of us, Mrs. Peterson argued back. We don't leave our own behind. But what if she doesn't make it anyway? Another voice chimed in. What if we all die waiting? For the inevitable? Captain Brooks's voice cut through the others like a knife. I'll give you 1 hour to decide, Miller. Either your family is ready to travel, or we leave you behind. I won't risk 19 other families for one woman who might not survive anyway. The words hit Marianne like a physical blow. Through her fever, she understood what was happening. She was becoming a burden, a danger to everyone else. The very thing she'd feared most when she discovered she was carrying twins. William disappeared from the wagon, and she could hear him talking urgently with Mrs. Peterson and a few other people. Their voices were low, but the tone was desperate. Marianne tried to focus on their words, but the fever made everything sound like she was underwater. Time seemed to move strangely after that. Sometimes she was aware of people moving around outside, loading wagons and preparing to leave. Other times she drifted in and out of consciousness, holding her babies and trying to keep them quiet. When she next became fully aware, the sun was higher in the sky, and there was a terrible silence around her wagon. No sounds of people talking or animals moving. Just the wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. William, she called out, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. Footsteps approached, but they were slow and heavy. When William appeared at the back of the wagon, his face was pale and his eyes were redrimmed. The others have gone ahead, he said quietly. They couldn't wait any longer. Marianne felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that she wouldn't hold back the other families, but terror at being alone in this vast wilderness with 2 newborn babies and a body that was failing her. But you stayed, she whispered. William looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I don't know what to do, Marianne. The babies need food, and you're too sick to nurse them properly. If we try to catch up to the wagon train, you might not survive the journey. But if we stay here... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both knew what happened to people caught alone in Sioux territory. Marianne looked down at her sons, both sleeping now in her arms. They were so small, so helpless. How could she ask William to sacrifice his life and theirs for her? How could she ask him to choose between his wife and his children? Take Thomas, she said suddenly, looking at the slightly larger of the twins. What, take Thomas and go catch up with the wagon train? You can find a woman there who's nursing. Mrs. Henderson lost her baby last month, but still has milk. William's face went white. I'm not leaving you. And I'm not asking you to let all 3 of us die out here, Marianne replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Take Thomas. I'll stay here with little William. Maybe the fever will break, and we can catch up later. But even as she said it, they both knew it was a lie. She was getting weaker by the hour, and a woman alone with a baby in hostile territory had almost no chance of survival. William was quiet for a long time, staring at his sons with an expression of pure agony. Finally, he spoke in a voice so low she almost didn't hear him. There's a creek just over that rise. Good water, some shelter from the cottonwoods. I could leave you supplies. Marianne closed her eyes, feeling tears leak out from under her lids. This was really happening. Her husband was going to leave her to die. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. Tell Thomas about me when he's older. Tell him I loved him. Tell him I wanted to be there to watch him grow up. William broke down then, sobbing like a child as he held both babies one last time. Marianne watched him memorize their faces, knowing he was trying to decide which son to take and which to leave behind with their dying mother. The choice he made would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, faced with an impossible decision in an unforgiving land, he did what he thought would save at least one of his children. An hour later, Marianne found herself alone by the creek with little William, watching her husband and Thomas disappear into the distance with the last of their supplies. The fever was making her see things that weren't there, but the baby in her arms was real, and he needed her to fight for just a little longer. She didn't know that 2 days later, a Lakota hunting party would find her nearly dead by the water's edge, or that her story was just beginning. 2 days had passed since William disappeared with Thomas, and Marianne drifted between life and death like a leaf floating on water. The fever had broken sometime during the first night, but it left her weak as a newborn kitten. She could barely lift her head, let alone care for little William properly. The baby cried constantly now, hungry and confused. Marianne tried to nurse him, but her body wasn't producing enough milk. She'd managed to give him tiny sips of creek water using a torn piece of her dress, but she knew it wasn't enough. Both of them were slowly dying. On the morning of the third day, she woke to find William had stopped crying. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was gone, but when she touched his tiny chest, she felt his heart still beating. He was just too weak to make noise anymore. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, holding him close. "I'm so sorry I can't take better care of you." She looked up at the sky through the cottonwood branches. It was a beautiful blue color, the kind of sky that made you believe in heaven.
Nice.
Maybe that's where they were headed. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. The sound of horses' hooves made her heart jump. At first, she thought she was hearing things again, like the voices and music that had visited her during the worst of the fever. But the sound got closer, and she realized it was real. Through the trees, she saw them.
Told.
3 men on horseback, moving slowly along the creek. Even in her weakened state, she knew immediately they weren't white settlers. Their long black hair flowed freely, and they sat their horses like they were born on them. Marianne's first instinct was fear. Awed her. Life. She'd heard stories about what happened to white women captured by Indians. But as she watched them, she realized she was too weak to run, too weak to hide, too weak to do anything but lie there and wait for whatever came next. The first rider was younger than the others, maybe 25 years old. He had strong shoulders and moved with a confidence that spoke of someone comfortable in the wilderness. His horse was a beautiful paint mare, brown and white patches that seemed to dance in the morning light. He stopped his horse when he saw her, saying something in his own language to the other 2 men. Marianne couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the surprise in his voice. The 3 men talked among themselves for several minutes, their voices low and serious. Marianne caught some of their glances and saw different emotions there. The older men looked suspicious, maybe even angry, but the young one kept looking at her baby. She thought she saw something softer in his eyes. Finally, the young man dismounted and walked slowly toward her. Marianne tried to sit up, tried to look less helpless than she felt, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She managed to pull William closer to her chest in a protective gesture. The warrior stopped a few feet away and studied her carefully. Up close, she could see he was even younger than she'd first thought. His face was painted with simple lines of red and yellow, and he wore a shirt decorated with beautiful beadwork that must have taken months to complete. He said something to her in his language, his voice gentle but questioning. When she didn't respond, he tried again, this time mixing in a few English words she recognized. "Water," he said, pointing to the creek. "Baby." Marianne nodded, understanding that he was asking if she needed water for the baby. "Yes," she whispered, her voice so hoarse it was barely audible. "Please."
Oh.
The young man turned back to his companions and spoke rapidly. Marianne could tell they were arguing about something. Older men kept gesturing toward the direction. The wagon train had gone, and one of them pointed at her with what looked like disgust. But the young warrior kept shaking his head, his voice getting stronger and more insistent. At one point, he gestured toward William, and Marianne caught a word that sounded like baby in their language. The argument went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the 2 older men seemed to give up. One of them said something that sounded like a warning, then they both mounted their horses and rode away. Leaving the young man alone with Marianne and her baby, he watched them go, then turned back to her. This time he approached without hesitation and knelt down beside her. Mary Ann tensed, not knowing what to expect, but he simply reached for a water pouch at his side and offered it to her. "Drink," he said in English, his accent thick, but understandable. Mary Ann took the pouch with shaking hands and managed a few sips. The water was cool and clean, better than anything she'd tasted in weeks. She looked at the baby, then at the warrior, trying to communicate her need. He seemed to understand immediately. Very gently, he helped her give William tiny drops of water. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, he seemed to focus on something. "Thank you," Mary Ann whispered. The warrior studied her face, then looked around at the small pile of supplies William had left behind. She could see him taking in the whole situation, the abandoned woman, the dying baby, the signs of a hasty departure. He spoke to her again, this time more urgently, and she caught the word "sick" in English. She nodded, touching her forehead. To indicate the fever, what happened next surprised her completely. The young man stood up and walked to his horse, returning with a bundle of dried plants. He showed them to her, then mimed drinking, indicating she should make tea from them. But Mary Ann was too weak to make tea, too weak to do much of anything. The warrior seemed to realize this, and after a moment of consideration, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He scooped up Mary Ann and William together, handling them as carefully as if they were made of glass. Mary Ann was too surprised and weak to protest as he carried them to his horse. Getting all three of them onto the horse took some effort, but the warrior managed it with a skill that spoke of years of experience. Mary Ann found herself sitting. In front of him, William cradled in her arms, while strong arms surrounded them both to hold the reins as they began to move. Mary Ann felt the warrior's chest against her back, steady and warm. For the first time since William had left her, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she and her baby might survive this ordeal. She didn't know where he was taking them or what would happen when they arrived. She didn't know if she was being rescued or captured. But as they rode through the grassland under the vast prairie sky, she felt something she hadn't felt in days, the possibility of a future. The warrior spoke softly to his horse as they traveled, his voice mixing with the sound of hoofbeats and wind through grass. Mary Ann didn't understand his words, but she understood the gentleness in his tone. This was a man who had chosen compassion over fear, who had risked the anger of his companions to help a stranger in need. Behind them, the creek where she'd nearly died grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead lay the unknown, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Mary Ann wasn't facing it alone. The Lakota village appeared like something from a dream as they crested a small hill. Dozens of buffalo hide lodges formed perfect circles on the grassland, their tops pointing toward the sky like prayers. Smoke drifted up from cooking fires, and Mary Ann could see people moving between the lodges, going about their daily lives. As they approached, children ran out to see what their returning warrior had brought back. Their excited chatter died away when they saw Mary Ann and her baby. Adults emerged from their lodges, faces showing everything from curiosity to concern to outright anger. The young warrior, who Mary Ann had started thinking of as her rescuer, called out to the people in his own language. She could hear him explaining the situation, his voice calm but firm. Several older men approached, their expressions serious as they looked at her. One elderly man with gray braids and weathered hands stepped forward. He spoke rapidly to her rescuer, his tone clearly questioning the wisdom of bringing white strangers to their home. Mary Ann didn't need to understand the words to know they were discussing her fate. But then an older woman pushed through the crowd and everything changed. She had kind eyes and graying hair, and when she saw William in Mary Ann's arms, her face softened immediately. She said something to the men that made them step back, then approached Mary Ann with her arms outstretched. The woman spoke gently, using gestures to show she wanted to help with the baby. Mary Ann hesitated for a moment, then realized she had no choice but to trust these people. She was too weak to care for William alone, and he needed help immediately. The older woman took the baby with experienced hands, examining him quickly while making soft cooing sounds. She looked up at Mary Ann and said something that sounded reassuring. and called out to some of the other women. Within minutes, Anne found herself being helped down from the horse and supported by several women as they guided her toward one of the larger lodges. Her legs barely held her weight, and she had to lean heavily on her helpers just to walk. Inside the lodge, buffalo robes were spread on the ground around a small fire. The older woman, who seemed to be some kind of healer, gestured for Marianne to lie down while she continued examining William. What followed was unlike anything Marianne had ever experienced. The healer began preparing various mixtures from bundles of dried plants and roots, explaining her actions in a mixture of Lakota and broken English. Other women brought water, clean cloths, and what looked like herbal teas. "Drink," the healer said, offering Marianne a cup of bitter-tasting liquid. "Make strong." Marianne drank without question. At this point, she was willing to try anything that might help her recover enough to care for her son. The liquid was awful, but it seemed to warm her from the inside out. The healer worked on William next, giving him tiny drops of something from a small clay pot. The baby, who had been listless for days, actually opened his eyes and made a small sound. For the first time since they'd been abandoned, Marianne felt a spark of real hope. Over the next few days, Marianne drifted in and out of consciousness as her body fought to recover from the ordeal. But even in her weakened state, she was aware of the constant care she was receiving. Women took turns sitting with her, offering food and medicine, checking on William. The healer, whose name Marianne learned was Running Deer, seemed particularly devoted to helping them both. She had lost her own baby many winters ago, Marianne learned through gestures and simple words. And caring for William seemed to bring her comfort as well as purpose. As Marianne grew stronger, she began to pick up basic Lakota words: Emni for water, Woyut for food, Hoxie for baby. The women laughed gently when she mispronounced things, but they always patiently repeated the correct sounds until she got them right. Her rescuer, whose name was Standing Bear, visited every day to check on their progress. Marianne learned that he was considered one of the tribe's best hunters, and that his decision to bring them to the village had caused quite a stir among the elders. "Why did you help us?" Marianne asked him one day when she was finally strong enough to sit up for extended periods. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, then spoke carefully in his accented English. "Mother, protect baby. Same for all mothers. Color of skin not matter when baby cry." His simple words hit Marianne harder than any lengthy explanation could have. In her own world, she had been abandoned because she and her baby were seen as a burden. Here, among people she'd been taught to fear, she had found the very compassion that her own husband had failed to show. As weeks passed, Marianne's strength returned gradually. She was able to nurse William properly again, and he began to thrive under the care of so many willing hands. The village women included her in their daily activities, teaching her how to prepare food, work with hides, and care for the lodge. But the emotional healing took much longer than the physical recovery. At night, when William was sleeping peacefully beside her, Marianne would lie awake thinking about Thomas. Was he still alive? Was William caring for him properly? Did her other son wonder where his mother had gone? The pain of losing half her family was almost unbearable, but it was complicated by another feeling she hadn't expected: gratitude. These people had saved her life when her own people had left her to die. They had welcomed her baby as if he were their own, giving him a chance to grow and thrive. Standing Bear seemed to understand her internal struggle without her having to explain it. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching William play with some of the village children, he spoke about his own losses. "Lost brother in battle to winters past," he said quietly. "Heart hurt long time, but hurt less when help others." Anne looked at him, seeing not the savage warrior she'd been taught to expect, but a young man who had also known loss and had chosen to respond with kindness rather than bitterness. "Your husband," Standing Bear said carefully, "he come back for you?" It was a question Marianne had been avoiding even in her own thoughts. The honest answer was that she didn't know. Part of her hoped William would realize his mistake in return for her. But a larger part of her had accepted that he had probably continued west with the wagon train, believing she was dead. "I don't think so," she admitted. Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Then you make new path. The baby need mother who live, not mother who wait for ghost." His words were simple, but they cut straight to the heart of her dilemma. She could spend the rest of her life mourning what she'd lost, or she could embrace what she'd found. She could remain a victim of abandonment, or she could become someone who had survived against impossible odds. Looking around the lodge at the women who had become her friends, at the man who had risked everything to save her, at her son who was laughing as he played with his new companions, Marianne began to understand that sometimes the family you choose can be stronger than the family you're born into. The prairie had taken away everything she thought she knew about herself, but it had also given her a chance to discover who she really was when everything else was stripped away. And that person, she was beginning to realize, was stronger than she had ever imagined. 8 months had passed since Standing Bear found Marianne by the creek, and her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. She could now speak Lakota well enough to tell stories to the children, help with tribal decisions, and share her own thoughts about everything from weather patterns to the best ways to preserve meat for winter. William had grown into a healthy, laughing boy who toddled around the village like he owned it. The other children included him in their games without question, and he spoke both English and Lakota words with equal ease. Watching him play, Marianne sometimes forgot that he hadn't been born into this life, but she never forgot about Thomas. Not a day passed without her wondering about her other son, imagining what he might look like now, whether he was healthy and happy. The pain of losing him had softened into a constant ache, like an old injury that flares up when the weather changes. Standing Bear had become more than her rescuer over these months. He had become her closest friend, her teacher, and eventually something deeper that neither of them had spoken about openly. He was patient with her grief, understanding about her divided heart, and endlessly kind to William. "You think about other son again," he said one evening as they sat outside his lodge, watching the sunset paint the sky, orange and purple. It wasn't a question. Marianne nodded, not trusting her voice. Standing Bear had learned to read her moods like changes. "In the weather is natural," he said softly. "Mother's heart big enough for many children. Love for one not make less love for other." "Sometimes I feel guilty," Marianne admitted, "for being happy here when Thomas might be suffering somewhere." "Guilt not help, lost son," Standing Bear replied. "But strong mother who lived good life, maybe that helps somehow. Maybe spirits carry love across distance." It was the kind of wisdom that had drawn Marianne to him from the beginning. Standing Bear saw the world in ways that made sense of things. That had confused her all her life. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by sounds of excitement from the edge of the village. Riders were approaching, and from the urgent voices, Marianne could tell they were bringing important news. Standing Bear stood up, automatically moving into the alert posture of a warrior. "Stay with William," he told her, then moved toward the commotion with several other men. Marianne gathered William into her arms and watched as the riders entered the village. They were young men from their own tribe, but they looked like they'd been traveling hard for days. Their horses were sweating and tired. The riders themselves looked dusty and exhausted. The men gathered around the newcomers, speaking rapidly in voices too low for Marianne to hear clearly. But she caught fragments words about white settlers, trading posts, something that made several of the men look in her direction. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Standing Bear returned to her side. His expression was serious, almost troubled. "What is it?" Marianne asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "Traders bring news from fort to the east," Standing Bear said carefully. "White man there, asking about missing woman and baby, offers trade goods for information." Marianne's heart stopped. "William, man gives description. Says wife and baby lost in storm many months ago. Says been searching ever since." The words hit Marianne like physical blows. After all this time, William was looking for her. The husband who had abandoned her to die was now claiming to be a grieving widower searching for his lost family. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Standing Bear replied. "This choice for you to make." Marianne looked down at the William in her arms, her son, who had been saved by the kindness of strangers, who had thrived in this village, who called Standing Bear father in Lakota and meant it with all his little heart. "He has Thomas," she whispered, the realization hitting her fully for the first time. If I go back, I could see Thomas again. Standing Bear nodded slowly. Is possible. But also possible he not want to share sons with mother who lived with Lakota people. The weight of the choice settled on Marianne's shoulders like a physical burden. Return to her old life and possibly reunite with Thomas. But lose the community that had saved her and the man who had shown her what love without conditions looked like. Or stay with the life she had built and accept that she might never see her other son again. What would you do? She asked, Standing Bear. Not my choice to make, he said gently. But I tell you what I see. I see woman who is left to die, become woman who help others live. I see mother who lost everything learn to find joy again. I see person who bridged two worlds with wisdom both sides need. Over the next 3 days, messengers went back and forth between the village and the trading post where William waited. Marianne learned that he had indeed continued west with the wagon train, reaching Oregon territory successfully. But guilt over abandoning his wife had eventually driven him to return and search for her. He had been looking for months. Following the trail back, checking with every settlement and trading post along the way, the story he told was that his wife and baby had been lost in a storm, and he was desperate to find any trace of them. Marianne knew she had to see him, had to face the man who had left her to die and demand answers. But she also knew that once she revealed herself to be alive, there would be consequences that went far beyond her own choices. The meeting was arranged for neutral ground. The trading post that sat halfway between the white settlements and tribal lands. Marianne would bring William with her, along with Standing Bear and several other warriors for protection, as they rode toward the meeting. She had changed so much in these months that she wondered if her husband would even recognize her. The frightened, dependent woman he had abandoned was gone, placed by someone who had learned to survive on her own strength. The trading post was a rough wooden building that smelled of leather and tobacco. When they arrived, Marianne saw a familiar figure pacing outside. William was looking older and more weathered than she remembered, but unmistakably her husband. When he saw her, his face went white as winter snow. Marianne, he whispered, as if seeing a ghost. Hello, William, she said. Her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. His eyes moved to the baby in her arms, then to Standing Bear beside her, then back to her face. She could see him trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand how his wife had not only survived, but seemed to be thriving. I thought you were dead, he said finally. I came back to bury you properly, to say goodbye. You left us to die, Marianne replied simply. If these people hadn't found us, your assumption would have been correct. William's face crumpled with shame and relief and confusion all mixed together. I was trying to save Thomas. I thought you were going to die anyway, and I couldn't bear to lose you both. Where is Thomas now? Marianne asked, the question that had burned in her heart for months. With the Hendersons in Oregon? Mrs. Henderson has been caring for him. William's voice broke slightly. He's healthy and growing, but Marianne, he needs his real mother. We both need you to come home. Marianne looked at Standing Bear, who had remained silent through this exchange. In his eyes she saw understanding, support, and something that looked like goodbye. I am home, she said quietly, but loud enough for both men to hear. The question is whether there's room in this world for all the people I love. What happened next would test the boundaries of two cultures, two ways of life, and one woman's determination to create a family that honored both the son she had lost and the son she had saved. The man who had abandoned her and the man who had rescued her. The world she was born into and the world that had chosen to embrace her.